The Capitol building had witnessed its share of history, but what happened shortly after 5 p.m. on April 12, 1945 was never written into any official record. Vice President Harry S. Truman had just wrapped up a Senate session when he received a message. "Come to the White House at once." No explanation, no chance to ask why. Minutes later, he arrived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, bewildered but steady. He was guided through the main entrance, not to the usual greeting room, but up to the second floor. There, Eleanor Roosevelt stood waiting in silence. "Harry," she said softly, "the president is gone." Shocked, Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. She shook her head. "Is there anything we can do for you?" she answered. "You are the one in difficulty now." It was true, and Truman felt it instantly. He had just become the most influential man on earth with no preparation, no warning, and no instructions. FDR had died of a massive stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia. The nation was still at war. The atomic bomb was weeks from completion. Stalin and Churchill were watching, and no one, not the cabinet, not the military, not even the First Lady, had any idea what Truman would do next. The oath came quickly. Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone read it from a card in the cabinet room while Roosevelt's staff crowded around. One aide later said Truman looked as if a building had collapsed onto him. Another noted, he gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned pale. But the real moment of reckoning came hours later. In a small adjoining room, Secretary of War Henry Stimson quietly pulled Truman aside. "We need to brief you on a matter of tremendous importance," Stimson said. Truman nodded, assuming the discussion would concern troop movements or negotiations. Instead, Stimson told him about a top-secret military program known only to a few men in the entire U.S. government, a project to create a weapon of unprecedented might by harnessing atomic energy. It was the first time Truman had ever heard the name. The Manhattan Project, a $2 billion venture employing more than 100,000 people across several states, racing to split the atom before Hitler's scientists could. And the man who had authorized, expanded, and shielded the project, Roosevelt, had never told him a thing. Truman froze. This wasn't simply a new weapon. It was a new kind of war, and he had no briefing, no files, no background, only the responsibility. He turned to Stimson. "Why didn't President Roosevelt tell me?" Stimson paused. He ran a very personal administration. In that instant, Truman understood. He hadn't just inherited a presidency. He had been dropped into a void. The commander was gone. The secrets were sealed. And America's next chapter was his to craft, blind. The public assumed the transition had been seamless. This was the United States, the world's strongest nation. Surely the vice president had been informed. Surely he was prepared. Surely Roosevelt, master strategist and statesman, had briefed his successor. But the truth was far harsher. During his final months, Roosevelt had barely acknowledged Truman. After Truman was sworn in as vice president in January 1945, he was essentially excluded from the upper tiers of decision-making. He did not attend key war planning sessions. He was not included in major diplomatic discussions. And most remarkably, he was never told about the atomic bomb. The vice presidency under Roosevelt had become largely ceremonial, a placeholder. When asked what his duties were, Truman once joked, "I sit around and listen to the Senate debate." That's all. He wasn't exaggerating. Truman had met privately with Roosevelt only twice during his short tenure as vice president. Neither meeting involved critical policy, world affairs, or succession planning. Roosevelt kept the conversations light, even distant. Why? Because Roosevelt never expected to die. And if he did, he didn't intend to hand over control. Not to Truman. Not to anyone. Roosevelt's choice of Truman had little to do with leadership continuity. It was political calculation. By 1944, Roosevelt was gravely ill, though the public didn't know it. His previous vice president, Henry Wallace, was deemed too liberal by party leaders. Truman became the compromise candidate, modest profile, strong Midwestern support, and a reputation for honesty from his Senate investigations into wartime corruption. Roosevelt accepted him for the ticket, but never brought him into the inner circle. Some of Roosevelt's advisors, Harry Hopkins, James Burns, held more genuine authority than Truman. They had access to Yalta documents, Soviet communications, and nuclear research. Truman, meanwhile, remained uninformed. He later confessed, "The first 6 months of my presidency were like trying to learn to swim without ever having touched water." The most striking proof of his exclusion, on the day he became president, Truman had to ask what Roosevelt had been negotiating at Yalta only weeks earlier. No briefing folder. No transition notes. No plan. Just emptiness. The idea that Roosevelt prepared Truman is not only wrong, it's perilous. It shows how dependent the U.S. government had become on one man's judgment, and how neglectful Roosevelt had been about ensuring continuity after him. The country relied on its institutions. Roosevelt relied on his instincts. And Truman, the uninformed vice president, had to rebuild the most powerful office on the planet from scattered pieces. He had to learn rapidly, alone, with time running out. To understand why Truman was left uninformed, we must understand how Roosevelt governed. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't operate like a conventional president. He operated like a monarch of sorts. His administration functioned less like a structured government and more like a personal domain, one where information flowed not through offices, but through individuals, his trusted circle. He built what insiders called the Roosevelt system. A political machine that bypassed traditional channels in favor of personal influence. Informal advisors and off-record deals. Cabinet meetings, rare briefings. Selective succession planning non-existent. Roosevelt hated bureaucracy. He preferred to operate through personal emissaries like Harry Hopkins, whose word often carried more weight than that of cabinet secretaries. Hopkins would sit with Churchill, dine with Stalin, and then return to the White House with no official transcript, only Roosevelt's private trust. Other insiders like James Burns, Admiral Leah, and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had Roosevelt's ear. They spoke his language: improvisation, secrecy, loyalty. In this system, the vice president wasn't a partner. He was a spare tire. Roosevelt had already gone through 2 VPs before Truman. John Nance Garner, 1933-41, had called the job not worth a bucket of warm spit. Henry Wallace, 1941-45, was popular with liberals, but Roosevelt found him too idealistic. So in 1944, under pressure from party bosses, Roosevelt accepted Truman but made no effort to integrate him. This wasn't personal. It was procedural. In Roosevelt's mind, the VP had no need to know. He was running the war himself. Personally, strategically, secretly. Take the Manhattan Project. From its inception in 1939, the atomic bomb program was tightly controlled. Roosevelt told only a handful of people, and Truman wasn't one of them. The Army Corps of Engineers oversaw construction, but ultimate decisions were made by a tiny group known as the Top Policy Group, reporting directly to FDR. Even Vice President Wallace for a time was given more access to wartime logistics and foreign aid programs than Truman ever received. Truman would later recall, "I was just as surprised as anyone when I learned about the bomb. They hadn't told me a thing." But the bomb wasn't the only secret. Roosevelt also kept Truman out of post-war planning, especially negotiations with Stalin at Yalta in February 1945. FDR had made sweeping decisions about Poland, Eastern Europe, and the future of the United Nations. None of it was shared with Truman, even after the conference ended. When Truman took office, he had no idea what promises had been made or how the Soviets interpreted them. Roosevelt had ruled as if he would live forever, as if continuity didn't matter, as if no one else needed the keys to the war machine. But death came early. And when it did, it exposed the most fragile truth of the Roosevelt system. It only worked with Roosevelt at the center. Truman wasn't just excluded. He was starting from scratch with ghosts, secrets, and no instruction manual. Roosevelt's charm masked a brutal reality. He took critical national secrets to the grave and left his successor guessing in a world on fire. And the data proves it. Let's start with the biggest one. 130,000, that's how many people were working on the Manhattan Project. The most secretive, most expensive military operation in U.S. history. Entire towns like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, were built in total secrecy. The program cost over $2 billion, nearly $30 billion today. And Truman, the vice president, knew nothing until Roosevelt died. Then there's this too. That's how many private meetings Truman had with Roosevelt from January to April 1945. In one, they discussed Senate business. In the other, Roosevelt spoke briefly about the war's progress. Nothing strategic, nothing sensitive. Not once did Roosevelt speak to Truman about post-war planning, atomic research, or diplomatic commitments. Zero. That's how many documents Truman received from the Alta Conference. Even after Roosevelt returned, the United States had just redrawn the map of Europe with Stalin and Churchill. Truman wasn't given the agreements, the transcripts, or the context. He had to request them from the State Department after becoming president. And Roosevelt's health. That's where the numbers get dangerous. By mid-1944, the president's heart was failing. He had been diagnosed with congestive heart disease and hypertensive heart failure. His doctors knew, his family knew, but the public and Truman were left in the dark. Roosevelt gave the impression of strength during the 1944 campaign, even as he could barely stand without assistance. His face was ked, his voice frail. He was, in truth, dying. But when Democratic Party leaders pushed for a replacement VP, they did it without Roosevelt's input. And when they picked Truman, Roosevelt gave him no medical disclosure. The result, Truman was 3 months away from becoming president and had no idea that Roosevelt was on the edge of collapse. One Roosevelt aide later admitted, "We all pretended he would live forever. We knew he wouldn't, but no one said it out loud." The consequences of this silence were staggering. When Truman took office on April 12, 1945, he lacked a clear understanding of Roosevelt's agreements with Stalin, full awareness of U.S. troop deployments and supply chains, any knowledge of the atomic bomb, strategic insights into Japan's surrender conditions, and inner circle he could fully trust. In short, he was commander-in-chief of a global war and had never been shown the playbook. And that vacuum came at a price. 4 weeks after taking office, Truman scrambled to reconstruct FDR's network from scratch. He had to re-earn the military's trust, reframe diplomatic signals, and rebrief himself on files his predecessor had never shared. It wasn't just inefficient. It was dangerous. Because when nuclear weapons, global armies, and rival empires are involved, secrets don't just hurt, they destabilize nations. April 13, 1945. The morning after Roosevelt's death, Truman woke up to a world he didn't command, but now had to control. The headlines were still printing obituaries. The nation was still in mourning. But inside the Oval Office, military leaders were already lining up outside the door. There were no training wheels, no transition period, just one man, one chair, and a flood of war. The first decisions weren't symbolic. They were deadly serious. A briefing with General George C. Marshall revealed a Europe half liberated, but dangerously unstable. The Soviet Union was refusing to pull back in Poland. Stalin was ignoring private agreements made at Yalta. American forces were overstretched. Allied coordination was fraying. Truman blinked. What was promised to Stalin at Yalta, he asked. No one in the room had a clear answer. Then came the Pacific briefing. General Douglas MacArthur reported that Japanese forces were still entrenched across thousands of islands. An invasion of the mainland was being planned, named Operation Downfall, expected to cost over 500,000 American lives. The war could drag on for another year. Again. Truman asked, were there conditions for Japan's surrender? Again, the answers were vague. But the most critical moment came when Secretary of War Henry Stimson requested a private meeting. Inside, Stimson handed Truman a slim folder. It had no official cover, no signature. Inside, a classified memo outlining the progress of the Manhattan Project. Truman read in silence. A bomb using uranium and plutonium capable of destroying entire cities in one blast. It was weeks from readiness. It could potentially end the war in a single strike. And Roosevelt had never mentioned it. Truman turned to Stimson. Why wasn't I told? Stimson didn't have a clear answer. He only said it was a presidential decision. Only a few were informed. Not even the vice president. Truman was stunned. He wasn't just discovering a weapon. He was discovering that Roosevelt's presidency had been a one-man show and that he was now expected to keep it running without rehearsal. By the end of day one, Truman had to assure Allied leaders that U.S. leadership was stable, approve military directives in Europe and the Pacific, begin digesting atomic weapons policy, navigate a post-war map he hadn't helped build trust with a cabinet still loyal to FDR. And every one of those decisions exposed the same truth. Truman had inherited the throne, but not the kingdom. He lacked the files, the access, the allies, and the context. His first 24 hours weren't about vision. They were about survival. He later wrote, it was like being dropped into a cockpit with no instruments, no co-pilot, and no training. And the plane was already in the air. Day one wasn't ceremonial. It was war, and Truman was flying blind. FDR's presidency had been built on improvisation. He trusted his instincts, navigated crises by feel, and surrounded himself with loyalists who could read his moods better than any memo. For over 12 years, it worked barely. But when Roosevelt died, that system fell apart in seconds, and Truman was left holding the pieces. The collapse wasn't theoretical. It was operational. Bureaucrats didn't know who to report to. Generals were unsure what commitments had been made. Allies wondered if America's war posture would change overnight. The very architecture of global command forged in Roosevelt's personal handshake diplomacy was now suspended in air. And the math didn't lie. 12 years. That's how long Roosevelt had served. Long enough to build a White House that revolved entirely around him and no one else. Zero succession plan. Despite failing health, he refused to delegate or prepare anyone, including his vice president, for emergency transfer of power. 2 weeks, that's how long it took Truman just to locate and process all top-secret programs Roosevelt had overseen personally. From the Manhattan Project to lease logistics, Truman had to restart the engine from notes scribbled in the margins. But the real breakdown came in diplomacy. Foreign leaders had spent years building trust, not with the United States, but with Roosevelt. Stalin saw FDR as predictable. Churchill relied on his assurances. Allied Coordination had been run through Roosevelt's friendships, not formal treaties. And with Roosevelt gone, the room changed. Stalin stalled communications. Churchill privately questioned whether the U.S. would honor post-war commitments. Within weeks, cracks began to show, not because Truman was weak, but because he was unknown. The system Roosevelt built depended entirely on Roosevelt. That worked until he died. And here's the brutal irony. Roosevelt knew his health was deteriorating. By 1944, his doctors were warning of serious cardiovascular disease. But he told no one outside his inner circle, not even Truman. Especially not Truman, because if Roosevelt had acknowledged the risk of death, he would have had to do what he never wanted: share power. Truman would later say, "I came into this job with nothing prepared, no agenda, no plan, not even a locked drawer of documents." The United States didn't suffer a coup. It didn't fracture. It didn't collapse. But only because Truman held the line. Learning by doing, deciding without context, leading without clarity. And that's the real cost of the Roosevelt system. It wasn't just opaque. It was fragile. The world didn't know how close it came to chaos in the spring of 1945. But Truman did. And every memo he read, every file he opened, every day he sat in that chair reminded him that the math of Roosevelt's legacy wasn't scalable. Because when everything depends on one man, the moment he dies, everything breaks. April 25, 1945. The door closed behind General Leslie Groves and physicist Vannevar Bush. They were there for one reason: to brief the President of the United States on the most destructive project in human history. Harry Truman had been in office for just 13 days. He sat at the edge of the chair in the Oval Office as Bush placed a slim folder on the desk. No flash, no formal intelligence digest. Just a few typed pages that changed the course of the 20th century. "Mr. President," Bush began, "you're about to learn something that only a handful of men in the world know." The room fell silent as Groves took over, describing what had already been constructed. Vast facilities in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, thousands of engineers and physicists working in secret since 1942. Uranium and plutonium refinement, and bomb prototypes nearing completion. 1. Detail caught Truman off guard. 130,000 people? He asked. More than the number working on the Panama Canal, and we built a whole city. Groves nodded. And not one word of it has ever been made public or leaked. What Groves didn't say, but what didn't need to be said, was that Roosevelt had known it all, approved it, funded it, directed it, and deliberately kept it from his own vice president. Truman was stunned. This wasn't just a weapon. It was the weapon, and he was being asked to take command of it with no preparation. "Why didn't Roosevelt tell me?" he asked. Groves was blunt. That was his choice. Only he, Stimson, and a few scientists were fully briefed. The folder included yield projections. One bomb could level a city. No air force, no conventional weapon. No strategic bombardment in history could match what was about to be unleashed. Truman stared at the projections in silence. 20,000 tons of TNT in one device. He looked up. "And we're going to use it." Stimson nodded. "That will be your decision, Mr. President. No one else." In that moment, the absurdity of his situation crashed into view. Roosevelt had died with the most consequential military secret in world history locked inside his skull and never once shared it with the man who would inherit the power. Truman would later write, "It was the most terrible thing ever discovered, and I had no warning." From that day, Forward, Truman insisted on full control. He created the interim committee to study the use of the bomb. He demanded regular briefings. He read every scrap of intelligence, not because he had time, but because he had been burned. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a weapon. It was the embodiment of Roosevelt's solo presidency. Powerful, hidden, irreversible. And now Truman had to take ownership of it with no blueprint, no moral map, only judgment. And the clock was ticking because in a few weeks the bombs would be ready and the decision of the greatest in presidential history would fall to a man who hadn't even known they existed. July 17, 1945, Potsdam, Germany. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble. And now the leaders of the three great Allied powers, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, met to redraw the post-war world. For Truman, it was baptism by fire. This was his first international summit, his first face-to-face with Joseph Stalin, and the first time he would test what little he now knew about Roosevelt's secret world. He walked into the Sicilian Hof Palace, carrying classified briefings newly assembled by his staff. But unlike Roosevelt, Truman didn't come armed with years of relationship building. He hadn't shared cigars with Churchill. He hadn't toasted vodka with Stalin. He wasn't a known quantity. Stalin saw it immediately. To him, Truman wasn't Roosevelt's heir. He was a temporary actor, still blinking under the spotlight. And Stalin planned to test him. But Truman had one card up his sleeve: the bomb. By mid-July, the United States had successfully tested the world's first nuclear weapon at Trinity Site in New Mexico. A fireball had torn through the desert, brighter than the sun. The message from General Groves was clear. The bomb worked and it was ready. Truman was now holding power beyond imagination. And yet the instructions were vague. Roosevelt had made no plan for how to tell Stalin, no road map for diplomacy, no protocol for atomic disclosure. So Truman improvised. On July 24, after several days of tense discussions about Eastern Europe and post-war boundaries, Truman casually mentioned to Stalin that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin's response was flat. "I hope you make good use of it," he said. No questions, no reaction. Truman left the meeting puzzled, but in retrospect, the moment was chilling. Stalin already knew through Soviet spies embedded in the Manhattan Project. Stalin had been informed of American nuclear progress months earlier. He knew more about the timeline than Truman himself had known just a few weeks prior. Truman thought he was revealing a new power. Stalin saw a late arrival to a race already running. That moment, Stalin's controlled smile, his nod, his non-response, was Truman's second great realization. First, that he had been left in the dark by Roosevelt. Second, that America's secrets weren't as secret as they thought. Roosevelt's hidden diplomacy had created not just confusion at home, but vulnerabilities abroad. Soviet infiltration had exploited Roosevelt's loose command structure. No files, no protocols, no clearance reviews, just back-channel trust and personal control. The world saw a polished Roosevelt. The Kremlin saw an opening. Now Truman would have to clean it up. In the days that followed, Truman tightened control over nuclear policy. He refused Churchill's suggestions to immediately share information with Stalin. He began reshaping the national security structure, the early blueprint of what would become the CIA and the National Security Council. Potsdam wasn't just a negotiation. It was the day Truman understood the global battlefield Roosevelt had left behind. Friendly, faces, hidden agendas, smiles that meant nothing. And somewhere in the shadows, Stalin's grin, as if to say, "Welcome to the game, Mr. President. You're already behind." Truman was never supposed to lead. Not really. To Roosevelt, he wasn't a partner or a confidant. He was a running mate, a name added to the ticket to plate conservatives and balance the political map. Chosen not for his potential, but for his predictability, a placeholder, not a president. And Roosevelt never disguised it. Truman wasn't included in war councils. He wasn't briefed on the most important military development in world history. He wasn't told about secret pacts with Stalin or plans for a post-war order. He was a heartbeat away from the presidency and kept in the waiting room. This wasn't a slip. It was a system. Roosevelt had spent 12 years crafting an executive branch that revolved entirely around him. His network was informal. His communication style was personal. His diplomacy was improvised. It worked as long as he was alive. But when he died, the entire system imploded. Truman inherited a nation at war and a cabinet loyal to someone else. He stepped into a cockpit with no co-pilot, no map, and no instruction manual. And every hour brought new revelations about nuclear weapons, about global negotiations, about promises Roosevelt had made but never documented. The most painful part: it didn't have to be this way. Roosevelt had time, months, enough time to say, "Here's what's coming. Here's what you need to know." He had the resources, the team, the chance to give Truman a fighting start. But he chose not to. Some say it was hubris. Others say denial. Maybe Roosevelt couldn't admit he was dying. Maybe he thought he'd outlast the war. Maybe he believed no one else could carry the burden. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The United States didn't get a clean transition, it got silence. And Truman had to break that silence with every choice he made, rebuilding the presidency, reasserting authority, and proving he wasn't merely Roosevelt's echo. Because in the end, Truman wasn't a temporary stand-in. He was the survivor of the most perilous knowledge vacuum in presidential history. And the myth that Roosevelt prepared Truman, it ends here. He didn't prepare him. He didn't empower him. He scarcely acknowledged him. But Truman rose regardless. He accepted the bomb. He confronted Stalin. He ended the war and he shaped the peace. Not because Roosevelt guided him, but because Roosevelt left him no alternative. On August 6, 1945, just 4 months after learning about the weapon, Harry Truman authorized the strike. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Japan capitulated. The world shifted. But what few understand is how isolated that decision truly was. There was no outline, no Roosevelt blueprint, no precedent for deploying a weapon capable of erasing a city in moments. Roosevelt had concealed the project, concealed the research, concealed the diplomacy. And when the moment arrived, Truman stood alone with only a small circle of advisors, a thin briefing folder, and his own conscience. He would later remark, "I made the only choice I could, but I made it without the man who began it." That was the tragedy Roosevelt left behind: a nation still fighting, a weapon of annihilation, and a vice president treated like an outsider. But what if Truman had paused? What if the bomb had not been used? What if Japan had refused to surrender? What if the war bled into 1946 with 1 million American casualties? Next episode, we rewind history and examine the third bomb. What if Truman had waited? What the generals cautioned, what the scientists dreaded, and what might have unfolded if Truman had faltered. Subscribe to uncover the alternate path behind the decision that reshaped the world and nearly broke the man who made it.